to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie, and for those of you who are new to this channel, this is a channel where I read through all of the unread books on my bookshelf until I reach 0. And we are, of course, a long way from that. So today I wanted to go through the books I read in December and January. It's a little bit late for a recap, but actually I've been sort of procrastinating from making a video because I'm in a bit of a reading slump. And normally reading slumps are kind of a bad thing, but in this particular case, I don't care that much because I'm not in a reading slump because I've suddenly lost the desire to read. I'm in a reading slump because my life has just been so full of everything else. Work has started back again in February, but also I've been going to lots and lots of live music events, music festivals, and I went to the Taylor Swift concert, which was really, really fun. And so I don't mind actually not reading as much because I've been going out and filling my life with other really worthy, meaningful things. As the weather starts to cool again, and as I actually hopefully find a bit of time to go to the beach as well, I should be reading a lot more. So I'm not too fussed at the moment that I'm not reading as much as I would like to, but I actually did read quite a few books back in December and 2 more in January that I'd like to go through. So without further ado, let's start with the December books. So in December, the first book I read was Marilynne Robinson's book, Lila. Now, I read Gilead by Marilynne Robinson earlier last year in 2023. And one of the intriguing characters in Gilead was Reverend John Ames's wife, Lila. And Lila is the book that follows the life of the Reverend's wife as a woman who grew up in absolute poverty. She was born during kind of the Great Depression. I think that's the time frame anyway. She was born during the Great Depression in the American Midwest, and she was severely neglected by her own family as a child, and she effectively has no memory of that other than sort of being carried away by a woman called Doll. And Doll effectively becomes both her abductor but also her guardian, and she looks after her as a mother figure throughout Lila's life. And as Lila grew older, she stumbles into Gilead, which is a small town in Iowa, and she becomes involved with Reverend John Ames, who's the Reverend in town. And despite their huge difference in background, in outlook and personality, as well as age, because he's quite a bit older than her, they get married and they have a child together. And so this book tells that story, the latter part of which should be familiar to anyone who read Gilead. And one of the most touching part of the book actually was this process that we witness as the reader for Lila, as she goes from someone who's really sort of struggling with trauma and feeling as if she doesn't deserve happiness to someone who slowly brings down her kind of walls and learns to accept and learns to trust people. And it's this kind of push and pull process with her where she has to learn to trust in the kindness of strangers in this community that she's joined as the Reverend's wife. But she also wants to keep her sense of self-reliance and self-sufficiency that she's learned through just having an incredibly difficult life. So it's that kind of individualism versus community, but also that kind of trauma and melting away your exterior hardness and learning how to be vulnerable and trusting again. So I loved this book. It has all of the quiet elegance that Gilead had, but it's written from the perspective of Lila, who I think is actually a more interesting figure just because of her background. Marilynne Robinson released Gilead, Home, and Lila in that particular order, and I don't have Home on my unread shelf, so I was a little bit worried about having to skip over Home in trying to keep to the books on my bookshelf, and I did not need to have that worry, because actually both Gilead and Lila, at least, are entirely self-contained books. I don't even think you need to read Gilead before you read Lila. You could just go straight there, although I do really like Gilead, so I would recommend that you read it. But if you're concerned, like I was, about reading it in order, you don't need to be, because these books are sufficiently self-contained to tell you everything you need to know about the background to these characters. They're simply telling parts of the same story, but from slightly different character perspectives. So overall, I really liked Lila. It is a worthy follow-up to Gilead, and Gilead was actually one of my favorite books last year. So I'm going to try and read all of the books. I thought it was a trilogy, but actually I've since found out Marilynne Robinson has released a fourth book called Jack. So I'm going to try and read all 4 books at some point, but at the moment I'm still focusing on trying to tick as many books off my bookshelf as possible. So, but very happy to get this one off, and it was one of my top reads last year in December. The second book I read in December last year was The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin, and I'm holding up here the Chinese version, which I read in the original. And I bought this last year while I was visiting China, and I'm actually going back over Easter to see some family again. So I wanted to read this book before I went there so I can figure out whether or not I want to keep going with this trilogy. And I did look it up. This is an actual trilogy. So The Three-Body Problem is obviously one of the most famous Chinese books in recent years, because it won the Hugo Award, and it's, I have mixed feelings about it. So I'll talk a little bit about the plot of the book, and excuse me, I don't know all of the kind of translated terms and character names in the English version, because I only read it in the original language. So the book is set in 2 time frames and across 3 different plot lines, which all come together in the end. So the A plot follows the character Ye Wenjie against the backdrop of China during the Cultural Revolution. So Ye Wenjie is a young Chinese astrophysicist. She's sent to a remote village in the western part of China to work on a research base after her scientist dad was killed during the Cultural Revolution. And this part of the book is actually quite brutal because it kind of depicts quite accurately what happened during the Cultural Revolution to a lot of intellectuals who lost their lives, lost their freedoms, and lost their future. And a lot of them had to work in private and study in private to try and keep their knowledge and hope that, you know, this madness would come to an end one day. And I was a bit surprised at how honest the book was about what happened during the Cultural Revolution. It's not really clear to me, as someone who grew up in the West, what is still a taboo topic in China and what isn't. But certainly this book seems to have no issue selling millions and millions of copies in China. So I would suppose that they passed whatever census there was on publishing this kind of content there. So that's the A plot. And I guess part of the A plot is that while Ye Wenjie is working at this research base in a rural village, that project turns out to be a project in sending signals into outer space to try and contact alien civilizations. So that's your A plot. And then the A plot alternates with the B plot, which is set in present day China, where a scientist by the name of Wang Miao is working on nanotechnology. And the scientific world at the time was rocked by a series of quite high-profile suicides by physicists in particular. And why these physicists chose to end their lives is sort of this mystery that unravels throughout the course of the book. So that's your B plot. The C plot is a subset of the B plot, where Wang enters into a virtual reality game. So he sort of has these goggles and sort of sensors, so he can feel the heat and the wind in this virtual world where he's playing this game. And the game is called Three-Body. And in this game, as he gets higher and higher into the levels, it starts to feel less like a game and more like reality. And he discovers that this particular game actually tells the history of this alien civilization who has plans for invading Earth. And slowly these 3 plots come together towards the end of the book. And really by the end of the book, you reaching the start of the actual plot of the entire series. So it's a little bit disappointing when I got to the end and realized that actually none of the real events of this particular trilogy has actually started. This is just kind of a scene setting book. But overall, I guess I have mixed feelings about this book. The positives are that it's really written at quite an enjoyable pace. I'm not a huge reader of science fiction, but I did enjoy kind of the scientific elements and how they came into the plot. But what I didn't like was the actual writing itself. I felt like some of it was quite clunky in the way that you get sort of these vast slabs of plot, and then the plot would stop and the author suddenly starts explaining the science behind certain plot points that you need to know in order for the plot to progress. So it's actually not a very interwoven kind of book where the science goes hand in hand with the plot. Whereas in this one, you really have these kind of clunky explanations of science interspersed between all the plot points. So that's kind of my major problem with the book. The only other issue I had with the book, which I've already mentioned, is that when you get to the end of the book, you're really at the start of the actual plot of the trilogy, which is an alien invasion story. And I'm not spoiling it because actually in both the English version and the Chinese version of the blurb, it pretty much tells you it's an alien invasion story. So I am a little bit intrigued about how the alien invasion plays out. And as I said, I'm not a huge science fiction reader, but I do try to read widely, and I don't want to be one of those snobby people who only reads literary fiction or only reads fantasy or one of those genres. But overall, the first book was promising, but it has its faults, and I had my frustrations with it. Overall, it's good enough for me to keep reading. The third book I read in December, which was actually my favorite book that I read in December, was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I've actually never read this book, even though it's an absolute classic, and it's widely regarded as the book that sort of started the true crime genre. And this book tells the story of a murder in 1959 of 4 members of the Clutter family in Kansas. And Capote based this book on quite extensive interviews that he conducted with the killers, Dick and Perry, and also with members of the community where this murder happened, and absolutely shook and changed this community. And there's actually a fabulous film called Capote, which depicts this entire process. And the book itself traces all of the events leading up to the murder, but also the investigation and eventual capture and trial and execution of the murderers. So what you get is this entire life cycle of a murder and then the pursuit of justice after the murder. And the most memorable part of the book is the portrait of the 2 killers, Dick and Perry. They're not sympathetic figures by any stretch of the imagination, and Capote never tries to make you sympathize with them. But the problem is that he also depicted these 2 characters in such a nuanced and complex ways that they became undeniably human. And I was actually sad to read that they were executed, even though they were just the crimes they committed against this family were completely heinous. But you can't help but identify with someone who is so alive in the book. I absolutely love this book. I thought it was completely gripping. I've also really liked the short stories that I read of Truman Capote. Penguin does a small volume of, I think it was Breakfast at Tiffany's and some of the other kind of very short stories that Capote wrote. And I'm not sure who actually publishes Capote these days, other than sort of that very small Penguin volume and this. But I'd be keen to read more, because both of those books, this one and Breakfast at Tiffany's and those short stories, I've absolutely enjoyed. And I do look forward to reading a bit more and seeing if the quality holds up with other stuff that Capote has written. The final book I read in 2023 is Where Angels Fear to Tread by Ian Forster, and that came out of this collected edition of Ian Forster novels. I think there's 5 in here in total, so basically everything other than Morris. So the rule with collected volumes, for those of you who are new to the channel, is that reading one book out of the entire volume counts as reading the book, because I don't think, in my view, that these volumes are meant to be really read from start to finish in one go. And for me, as part of trying to get through my unread shelf, I do want to eventually read all of these collected volumes and everything by Ian Forster, but I'm not forcing myself as part of this project that I'm doing to do every single book in every single volume. So having read one book out of this collected edition, I'm ticking this off for the purposes of the project, but I do plan on coming back for other Ian Forster novels. This is the first Ian Forster novel I have ever read. And I thought I'd read them in basically publication order, which is why I started with Where Angels Fear to Tread. And I have to say it was really, really enjoyable for a first novel. The storyline follows the young English widow Lilia, and she travels to Italy with her friend Caroline Abbott. And Lilia falls in love with a young Italian in this village called Gino, and she decides to marry him, much to the disapproval of her English in-laws. And when Lilia becomes pregnant and then dies at childbirth, her in-laws decide that they must go and bring this child back to England and raise this child as an Englishman. And so a lot of comedy, but also heartbreak ensues in the wake of that process. And the story is just full of nasty people on both sides. Both the English and the Italian characters in the book are not particularly likable as characters, but Ian Forster treads this fine line between sort of mocking the British tourists who sing praises of Italy and her glories, to also waxing lyrical about Italy and her glories himself. And it's this interesting tension in the book. I have to say, overall, the book is actually quite enjoyable. It's witty, there's a lot of social commentary, and a lot of moral ambiguity, which I always like in a book. This is the first Ian Forster book that I read, as I mentioned, and I'm really looking forward to reading more. He's really, really readable. The plot and the pace is quite good. I don't particularly like sort of the sudden death of Lilia, which then introduces these new characters, because up until that point I thought Lilia was the main character of the book. But overall, I think these are things that that an author in their first book tries to work out, and I have no doubt that Ian Forster will vastly improve as an author as I make my way through his body of work. So I'm looking forward to that particular process. Now, in my last video, I mentioned that 2024 will be a year of reading French, and that's my reading theme of the year. I was going to read as many of the French novels on my unread shelf as possible. So in January, I thought I'd start with one that seemed like it was going to be a fun one, and that is The Charterhouse of Parma by Stendhal. And I was right. This was not only fun, but completely bonkers. So The Charterhouse of Parma, for those who don't know, was set in Italy during the Napoleonic Wars, and it follows the journey of Fabrizio, who's this Italian nobleman. At the start of the book, he runs away to France against the wishes of his own family to join the Napoleonic armies, sort of while they were on the verge of defeat. And he actually ends up fighting in the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium. And it sort of goes both off the rails and completely mad from that point on, but in the most enjoyable way possible. So Fabrizio travels from northern Italy to France, and then when he gets back, his family sort of turns against him, and he's being arrested for being a supporter of Napoleon, who had already lost at that stage. So he has to flee to a neighboring state in Parma. And at the time, the state of Parma was an absolute monarchy, and Fabrizio's aunt, the Duchess of, I think her name is San Severino, and her lover Count Mosca were both residing in the state of Parma, and they were sort of offering him both protection and a career path forward as a member of clergy. And when Fabrizio arrives in Parma, all kinds of drama ensues, and Fabrizio as a character is reckless. He's kind of stupid, He's extremely charming though, and always very, very comically amorous. And it's just such a mad book. I can't really describe it. The plot takes twists and turns that I never see coming. The standout characters of the book by far are the Duchess and Count Mosca. They are just an excellent couple. They're manipulative, they're cunning, they're kind of both a little bit sort of morally ambiguous, but at the same time, you really like them, and they're completely compelling as characters. The book itself, as I said, is completely mad. It's thrilling, it's gripping, it's totally different from the other standout book I've read, Red and the Black. Although I did read that many years ago when I was a kid, so it's probably well overdue for a reread. But still, I really enjoyed this book. It has kicked off my year of reading French to an excellent start, and I'm looking forward to rereading The Red and the Black later on in this year, and sort of giving a more recent comparison of the two books to see which one I like. The other book I read in January was a library book, and it's Going Infinite by Michael Lewis. So for those who don't know, Michael Lewis last year released a book about Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of the failed cryptocurrency exchange FTX. And I was intrigued because I knew quite a few people who lost a lot of money in the collapse of FTX. So I have a general idea of what happened just based on media coverage, and also based on, having to work with people who were dealing with the fallout and the flow-on effects of that industry at the time. And so I was really curious about what Michael Lewis had to say. And it's the first time I've read a Michael Lewis book. I have to say he is a really compelling writer. And the book follows Sam Bankman-Fried's life from his early days as this sort of awkward kid with no friends to becoming a high-frequency trader, to then his sort of meteoric rise as the crypto billionaire of his time, and finally the downfall as FTX unraveled and filed for bankruptcy in late 2022. And so Michael Lewis could not have painted a weirder picture of this guy. And his description of how FTX as a crypto exchange was being run at the time, it was almost like a bunch of kids were in charge and should have been supervised. It was absolutely one of those cases where the truth is stranger than fiction. And my problem ultimately with the book is that it paints too sympathetic a picture of Sam Bankman-Fried. It was almost like Michael Lewis got a bit sucked in and was a bit too charmed by Sam Bankman-Fried, which I was surprised by, because Michael Lewis is sort of known for writing a lot of books about finance industry, Wall Street type people, and I didn't think that Sam Bankman-Fried had the kind of charisma to hoodwink Michael Lewis into a more favorable view. But the book was ultimately very sympathetic to SBF in a way that I felt was completely unwarranted. When you consider that $8 billion of customers' funds weren't there when they asked for it, that I can't really see any reason for sympathy towards Sam Bankman-Fried in those circumstances. It caused a lot of pain to people who, some of whom lost everything. So I don't really have a lot of sympathy for this guy. Now, as a postscript, Sam Bankman-Fried was found guilty of fraud in November last year, and he's now awaiting sentencing. It looks like FTX will be able to actually compensate their customers and give them back most, if not all, of the money that was missing at the time. But it's important to note that just because FTX might be able to give their customers back their money doesn't absolve SBF and the team at FTX of their moral culpability and legal culpability, I should say, as well. Because a lot of the reason why they're now able to give back some of the money to their customers is because some of the cryptocurrency assets held by FTX has appreciated in value. So the money that wasn't there back in 2022 might now be there as the trustee in bankruptcy has made very strategic decisions to sell and take profits of those assets as the market's gone up. So it's not as if they actually didn't lose the money. When the customers asked for their money, they didn't have it, and they should have had it. So I don't really see that there's much exoneration to be done as far as those involved in the FTX collapse are concerned, and especially Sam Bankman-Fried. And that's the sour note that the book kind of left me with, which is I think I felt as if Michael Lewis went out of his way to try and exonerate SBF in a way that just was not consistent with the facts as they appear to me. But it was a gripping read. I'm actually sufficiently entertained by the book that I would keep reading books by Michael Lewis. So I'm having a bit of a look into it. Obviously, I don't want to stray too far from reading the books on my bookshelf, but I do want to occasionally change it up with some library books. So I'm looking forward to actually reading a lot more. So that's everything I read in December and January. I read 6 books in total, 4 in December and 2 in January. Of the books that I read in December, 3 of them were from my unread shelf. I don't count foreign language books as part of the unread shelf because I barely have any. And so the 3 Body Problem doesn't count. And as for January, Going Infinite was a library book. So I only read 1 book off my bookshelf. So that's a net of 4 books that I read off my unread shelf. And so that means I have 62 books left unread on my bookshelf. The exact stats are at the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I will probably not see you for February because I've hardly read anything. I will finish probably 1 book this month, but I'm going to do February and March recaps together. And we might talk a little bit about what I'm going to read in March because I have big plans. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you hopefully very soon.